The primitive theatre 70,000 years ago, there's no Netflix, YouTube, or TikTok. No smartphones illuminating focused faces, no notifications interrupting moments of immersion. But as stars dot the infinite sky, like a constellation of narrative possibilities, a circle of faces lit by the golden dance of flames, intensely watches a gesticulating figure. Their hands draw shapes in the air, creating shadows that stretch and contract on nearby cave walls. Every movement is deliberate, every gesture laden with ancient meaning. Their voice modulates between conspiratorial whispers and dramatic shouts, creating a primitive soundtrack that echoes through the vast night. Their eyes gleam with the same intensity as the fire warming them, reflecting not only the light of the flames, but also the passion of one who masters humanity's oldest art, transforming experience into narrative. The expressions around vary between fascination, fear, joy, and anticipation. Children cling to adults during the tensest parts, their small hearts beating to the rhythm of the story. Young adults absorb every word as if they were survival instructions, which in many cases they were exactly that. Elders nod knowingly, recognizing familiar patterns in new stories, their experienced minds connecting narratives across decades of oral tradition. The very air seems charged with expectation. The night wind whispers through the trees, creating a natural soundtrack that amplifies the drama of the moment. Occasionally, the crackle of wood in the fire punctuates an important phrase, as if nature itself conspired to create the perfect timing. This is theatre in its purest, most primitive state, without written scripts, without elaborate sets, without special effects beyond what the human imagination can conjure. This isn't just a moment of rest after the daily hunt or foraging. It's the birth of humanity's first streaming platform, a collective experience that would shape our species forever, creating the neurological and social foundations that still make us pause everything today to watch just one more episode. But what really happened in those ancient circles? How did a simple campfire transform into the cradle of human culture? Why were these nightly sessions so fundamental that they shaped the very structure of our social brain? And why, even today, in the digital age, do we continue to seek stories to connect with one another, even when physically isolated? The fire revolution, more than heat and protection. Approximately 400,000 years ago, our Homo erectus ancestors already consistently mastered fire. Archaeological evidence from sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa and Zhoukoudian in China shows controlled and organized hearths, indicating that the use of fire had become an established technology. But it was with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals between 200,000 and 40,000 years ago that this revolutionary technology transcended its basic function of heating, protection against predators, and cooking food. The discovery of organized campfires at archaeological sites like Qesem Cave in Israel and Lascaux in France reveals something fascinating. Our ancestors didn't just make fire. They created meticulously organized social spaces around it. Evidence shows precise stone circles. Shared food remains distributed in a way that suggests equitable division, and tools left in positions indicating prolonged and repetitive gatherings. Detailed analyses of sediments around these ancient hearths reveal layers of ash organized in specific ways, indicating that different types of wood were burned in intentional sequences. Some evidence suggests that our ancestors already understood that certain woods produced taller, more dramatic flames, ideal for storytelling, while others generated long-lasting embers, perfect for longer, more contemplative sessions. Even more revealing, these spaces show signs of continuous use for generations. Overlapping archaeological layers indicate that the same locations were used repeatedly, creating a kind of place tradition, humanity's first theatres, if we want to use a modern analogy. Stones worn smooth from constant use as seats, organized fuel depots, and even evidence of rudimentary decorations suggests that these places developed deep cultural significance over time. But it was anthropologist Richard Wrangham from Harvard University who proposed a theory that revolutionized our understanding of fire's role in human evolution. Fire didn't just cook our food, it literally cooked our humanity. By allowing us to gather after sunset, extending our social day far beyond natural light, fire created something completely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth: structured collective leisure time. Think about it in practical terms. Before the mastery of fire, hominid life was strictly dictated by the solar cycle. With light, they hunted, gathered, moved, resolved urgent conflicts. With darkness, they slept or hid. There was no temporal space for reflection, for processing experiences, for developing complex social bonds beyond those strictly necessary for immediate survival. Fire changed all that. For the first time in evolutionary history, a group of hominids could sit, relax, and simply exist together. Without the constant pressure of searching for food or fleeing predators, a completely new mental and temporal space emerged. It was as if we had invented the first prime time in history, a period specifically dedicated to entertainment, education, and social connection. And it was in this space that something magical and profoundly human began to happen. The first episodes, communication before words, the first episodes of this ancestral Netflix weren't exactly composed of words as we know them today. Linguistic evidence suggests that Homo sapiens developed complex verbal language around 70,000 years ago, but long before that, our ancestors already communicated through elaborate gestures, modulated sounds, dramatized facial expressions, and expressive body movement. Recent research in cognitive neuroscience shows that even today, when we listen to engaging stories, our brain processes implicit visual information with the same intensity as explicit verbal information. This suggests that our pre-linguistic ancestors already possessed surprisingly sophisticated narrative communication systems, based primarily on physical and vocal performance. Around the fire, these primitive forms of communication intensified dramatically. The natural play of light and shadow created a perfect stage where every gesture was amplified by projected shadows, every facial expression was dramatized by the dancing flames, every sound echoed more intensely in the protected circle from the outer darkness. It was as if each person transformed into a primitive actor, capable of evoking powerful emotions and conveying complex information merely through movement, voice, and physical presence. The very sounds produced around the fire had unique acoustic qualities. The circular geometry of the group naturally amplified the narrator's voice, while the constant crackle of the flames created a rhythmic bass that unconsciously synchronized the heartbeats of the listeners. Modern studies show that this involuntary physiological synchronization creates states of heightened empathy and emotional receptivity, precisely the ideal conditions for effective cultural transmission. Archaeological sites in France, like the famous caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, dated between 30,000 and 17,000 years ago, show us that our ancestors already created incredibly complex visual narratives. But long before sophisticated cave wall art, there was the art of the body around the fire, humanity's first form of theatre, where the stage was the illuminated circle, the scenery was the dancing shadows, and every member of the group was simultaneously actor and audience. Ethnographic evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies shows that these pre-linguistic performances followed specific dramaturgical conventions, body postures that indicated different character types, vocal modulations that suggested particular emotions, and gestural sequences that represented standardized actions like hunting, fleeing, or celebrating. It was a shared performative vocabulary that allowed complex narratives even in the absence of sophisticated verbal language. Dr. Robin Dunbar, a primatologist at Oxford University and creator of the famous Dunbar's number, which limits to about 150 the number of stable social relationships a human can maintain, proposes that it was precisely this growing need for group cohesion that propelled the development of language. Larger and more complex groups needed more sophisticated ways to share not only practical information, but also emotions, subjective experiences, and abstract concepts. Fire provided the perfect setting for this linguistic and social evolution, the ancestral content catalog. But what kind of content did our ancestors consume on this first entertainment platform in history? The answer is surprisingly familiar to anyone who has spent hours browse Netflix's recommendation algorithms or lost track of time on YouTube. The action adventures, detailed accounts of recent hunts, dangerous encounters with predators, discoveries of new resource-rich territories. These stories weren't just passive entertainment, they were sophisticated survival manuals disguised as engaging narratives. Every detail about a mammoth's behavior during mating season, every clue about the seasonal location of fresh water, every description of how a particular plant reacts in different weather conditions was vital information transmitted through emotion, suspense, and emotional identification. Analyses of modern hunter-gatherer societies reveal that these adventure narratives incorporated elements of primitive gamification. Experienced hunters deliberately structured their accounts to include moments of critical choice, creating narrative tension that forced listeners to actively think about alternative strategies. What would you do if you found fresh leopard tracks near the water source during the dry season? Wasn't just a rhetorical question, it was a cognitive training exercise disguised as entertainment. Studies with contemporary hunter-gatherer societies show that these adventure stories follow specific narrative patterns that maximize both information retention and emotional impact. They begin by establishing the context, where, when, who, develop conflict, the encounter with danger or challenge, reach a climax, the moment of greatest tension, and conclude with resolution, how the problem was overcome, and crucially, the lesson learned. The family dramas, conflicts within the group, unrequited love stories, rivalries among hunters, betrayals of trust, emotional reconciliations, and power dynamics. Detailed anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Kung of the Kalahari and the Hadza of Tanzania, show that up to 60% of nightly conversations around the fire revolved around interpersonal relationships, essentially a primitive reality show but with real consequences for group cohesion. These social narratives served multiple crucial functions. They helped process conflicts without direct confrontation, establish social norms through positive and negative examples, strengthened alliances through shared empathy, and allowed individuals to navigate complex social politics without direct risks. It was a primitive form of collective therapy, where relational traumas were processed collectively and solutions emerged through narrative consensus. Research in evolutionary psychology suggests that our modern obsession with relationship dramas in TV series, soap operas, and reality shows derives directly from this ancestral need to process complex social dynamics through safe narratives. When we watch dramatic conflicts on television, we are essentially exercising cognitive muscles that evolved to navigate tribal politics around the campfire. Supernatural horror. With the darkness filled with mysterious sounds and invisible threats, it was natural for our ancestors to create supernatural explanations for incomprehensible phenomena. Devastating storms, terrifying eclipses, sudden and unexplained deaths, mysterious diseases, everything became material for stories that blended real fear with explanatory fantasy. But these horror stories served deep psychological purposes. They allowed the group to process collective fears in a safe environment, created systems of meaning for traumatic events, and established behavioral protocols for dangerous situations through memorable narratives. A story about evil spirits attacking lone travelers was, essentially, an ancestral PSA about the dangers of wandering alone at night. Modern neurological evidence shows that horror stories activate alert systems in the brain in a controlled manner, functioning as danger simulators that prepare the organism for real threats. Our ancestors intuitively understood that experiencing fear in a safe context strengthened adaptive responses without the evolutionary costs of facing real dangers. The ancestral documentaries, elaborate stories about how things began, the first creation myths that attempted to explain the origin of the known world. How was fire first discovered? Why do different types of animals exist with specific behaviors? How did mountains and rivers come about? Why do the seasons change? These proto-mythologies were the first systematic human attempts to understand and organize reality through coherent narratives. Studies in cultural cognition show that creation myths serve specific cognitive functions. They reduce existential anxiety by providing explanations for the unknown, create a sense of group identity through shared narratives of origin, and establish moral frameworks that govern social behavior. They were, essentially, humanity's first cultural operating systems. The neuroscience of the campfire. Why it worked so well, but why was this specific experience around the fire so powerfully effective in creating social cohesion and transmitting information? The answer is literally etched into the architecture of our modern brain. When we hear an engaging and well-told story, our brain doesn't completely distinguish between directly lived experience and narrative absorbed through others. Mirror neurons activate in similar patterns, releasing the same neurotransmitters we would feel if we were actually living that dangerous adventure, that impossible romance, or that transformative discovery. Cortisol during moments of maximum tension, dopamine during moments of triumph and resolution, oxytocin during moments of emotional connection and mutual recognition. Recent neuroimaging research shows that during intense narrative experiences, brain areas associated with direct experience light up almost as much as during real events. This means that a well-told story about escaping a predator activated neurological fight-or-flight systems almost as much as a real escape, but without the associated metabolic costs and physical risks. Dr. Paul Zak, a neuroscientist at Claremont Graduate University and a pioneering researcher in neuroeconomics, has demonstrated through rigorous studies that well-told stories significantly increase oxytocin levels, the hormone of trust, social connection, and cooperative behavior. Imagine the evolutionary impact of this on groups of 20 to 40 people who literally depended on each other for survival in hostile environments. A single successful nightly session could transform interpersonal tensions into group cohesion, converting competitive individuals into collaborative teams. Furthermore, the very act of staring into a fire has unique and measurable neurological effects. The hypnotic and seemingly random pattern of the flames activates alpha waves in the brain, inducing a state of receptive but alert relaxation, precisely the ideal mental state for absorbing and processing complex information, forming lasting memories and developing deep emotional connections with other individuals. Electroencephalography studies show that groups of people observing the same fire develop brainwave synchronization, a phenomenon known as neural coupling that directly correlates with increased empathy, mutual trust, and cooperative behavior. It was as if nature had developed a social synchronization technology based on gentle collective hypnosis. It was as if nature had conspired to create the perfect environment for collective learning, social cohesion, and cultural transmission. Fire provided not only the physical setting, but also the ideal neurological conditions for our species to develop its most distinctively human characteristics. Narrative democracy. Everyone could be a protagonist. One of the most revolutionary characteristics of this Paleolithic Netflix was its fundamentally democratic and participatory nature. Unlike many modern forms of entertainment, where we are essentially passive consumers of content created by distant professionals, the sessions around the fire were structurally interactive and inclusive. Any member of the group could, in principle, become a storyteller. Children learned by observing adult narrative patterns, experimenting with their own small stories, and gradually developing their skills as tellers. It was an organic educational system where each individual progressed naturally through increasing levels of narrative complexity and cultural responsibility. Young adults practiced their narrative techniques as a way to develop social status and attract potential mates. Storytelling ability literally became a sexually selected trait. Individuals who could entertain, educate, and emotionally move through narratives had measurable reproductive advantages. This explains why, even today, a sense of humor and communication skills are among the most valued traits in partner selection. Adults shared recent experiences and practical knowledge, transforming every daily adventure into potential content for nightly entertainment. Elders passed down accumulated wisdom over decades and functioned as living libraries of cultural information. Their aging brains, rich in decades of narratives, became invaluable cultural resources for group survival. It was an integrated system of education, entertainment, and cultural preservation, operating simultaneously and organically. There was no artificial separation between producers and consumers of content. Everyone was both, depending on the moment and circumstance. It was completely democratized streaming, where every user was also a content creator. Contemporary ethnographic studies with the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the world's last genuine hunter-gatherer societies, show that these nightly sessions function as a kind of sophisticated collective processing of the day's individual and group experiences. Traumas are shared and emotionally distributed among the group. Successes are celebrated collectively, amplifying the individual's social value. Fears are confronted through narrative in a safe and supportive environment. Dr. Polly Wiesner, from the University of Utah and one of the most respected anthropologists specializing in hunter-gatherer societies, meticulously documented that during the day, Hadza conversations focus only 6% on narratives and stories, primarily concentrating on immediate practical matters. But at night, when the fire is lit and the group gathers, that number dramatically jumps to 81%. An almost total behavioral transformation. The transformation is clear and measurable. When the sun sets and the fire lights up, they literally switch mental channels from practical and urgent survival to the emotional, cultural, and narrative processing of the human experience. It's as if they possess two distinct cognitive operating systems, a daytime mode focused on practical efficiency and a nighttime mode dedicated to cultural construction and social connection. The natural algorithm. How stories went viral, but how did these stories spread among different groups? How did some narratives manage to go viral across vast networks of cultural exchange while others were quickly forgotten? The answer reveals a fascinating natural algorithm that still governs much of what we consume digitally today. Stories that combined specific elements had dramatically higher chances of long-term cultural survival. Intense emotion that created vivid memories, practically useful information that improved survival chances, supernatural or unusual elements that facilitated memorization, and narrative structures that easily adapted to different contexts and audiences. It was a kind of natural selection of narratives. The best stories reproduced through retelling, adapted to new cultural environments, evolved through creative variations, and survived through generations because they offered real value to the groups that kept them alive. Analyses of contemporary oral traditions reveal that ancestral viral narratives followed specific formulas. They began with familiar elements that established recognizable context, introduced novelty elements that captured attention, developed tension through conflict or mystery, and concluded with resolution that provided emotional satisfaction and practical lesson. Researchers like Dan Sperber, a pioneer in the field of cultural epidemiology, propose that our mind evolved with specific cognitive filters for culturally relevant types of information. We are naturally attracted to stories about imminent danger because they prepared for real threats, sex and romance because they helped in mate selection, social status and hierarchy because they determined our position in the group, cooperation and altruism because they strengthened group bonds, betrayal and deception because they protected against exploitation, and the supernatural and mysterious because they offered explanations for the inexplicable. Linguistic evidence suggests that the most viral stories of prehistory were those that incorporated multiple categories simultaneously: a narrative about a brave hunter, status, who faces a supernatural animal, mystery, to save his tribe, altruism, and win a partner, romance, while avoiding betrayal from rivals, social conflict, had a much higher probability of being retold and preserved across generations. This primitive algorithm of narrative selection explains why even today, the most popular content on digital platforms obsessively revolves around the same universal themes: survival, reality shows, nature documentaries, relationships, romantic dramas, reality shows, mystery, thrillers, true crime documentaries, humor, comedies, memes, and transcendence, science fiction, fantasy, spirituality. The digital campfire, modern connections and disconnections. Fast forward to 2025. You're on the couch, browse Netflix, sifting through endless content options with a level of choice your ancestors could never have imagined. Without fully realizing it, you are repeating a behavioral ritual that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. The neurological need remains exactly the same: genuine emotional connection, shared experiences that transcend individual isolation, understanding the world and the human place in it through meaningful narratives. But something fundamental has changed in the transition from campfire to screen. Where our ancestors lived, stories in immediate physical community, processing emotions collectively and building real social bonds, we often consume them in social isolation, even when physically close to others. Where they actively participated in the creation, adaptation, and interpretation of narratives, we are essentially passive spectators of content produced by distant strangers. Where they processed experiences collectively through discussion and interaction, we process individually, often without sharing insights or emotions. The irony is paradoxical. We have access to more high-quality narratives than any previous generation in human history, yet we experience increasing levels of social isolation and emotional disconnection. We have more content than we could consume in multiple lifetimes, but we often feel bored and dissatisfied. We have communication technologies that instantly connect people across different continents, but epidemics of loneliness affecting all age groups. It's no coincidence that cultural phenomena like collective binge-watching, interactive live streams, participatory meme culture, and platforms like Discord recreate digitally and often unconsciously essential elements of that ancestral campfire experience. We are constantly trying to replicate, through technology, that primordial sense of community through shared narrative. The explosive popularity of podcasts, a medium that simulates intimate and personal conversations, can be seen as an unconscious attempt to return to those nightly sessions where familiar and trusted voices shared stories in the protective darkness. Platforms like Clubhouse, which prioritize live audio conversations over visual communication, tap into the same deep ancestral instinct. Even seemingly modern phenomena like Netflix and chill or series marathons with friends represent instinctive attempts to recreate elements of the ancestral experience, collective consumption of narratives in a safe and intimate space, shared emotional processing, and strengthening of social bonds through common narrative experiences. The Eternal Fire, Reflections on Narrative and Humanity. As you read these words, probably illuminated by the artificial light of a digital screen, millions of people around the world are doing exactly the same thing our ancestors did 100,000 years ago, actively seeking stories that make us feel less alone in the infinite universe, that help us process the overwhelming complexity of the human experience, that connect us to something greater than our limited individual existence. The campfire never truly went out, it just changed physical form. From dancing flames to glowing pixels, from the modulated voice of the storyteller to the processed sound emerging from headphones, we continue to gather virtually around the same ancestral fire, seeking the same fundamental elements: meaning, connection, understanding, and the temporary transcendence of existential loneliness. Modern digital platforms, with their sophisticated algorithms and infinite libraries, are essentially technologically mediated attempts to recreate that primal experience around the fire. Recommendation engines are digital versions of those experienced storytellers who knew exactly what story to tell for which audience at which moment. Trending topics are digital echoes of those narratives that went viral through ancestral tribal networks. Comment sections and social media reactions are digital substitutes for the immediate emotional responses and interpretive discussions that followed each ancestral narrative session. But perhaps the most significant difference is not technological, but social. Where our ancestors experienced narratives as fundamentally collective experiences that strengthened community bonds, we often consume them as individual products for personal gratification. Where they used stories as tools to build and maintain social cohesion, we often use them to temporarily escape social responsibilities. Perhaps the most interesting question is not exactly what we've lost since those primitive circles around the fire, but what we still carry deeply ingrained in our neurological and behavioral structure. In every series we obsessively binge-watch, in every story we compulsively share on social media, in every moment we voluntarily pause our busy and hyper-connected lives to lose ourselves completely in a narrative, we are honoring and continuing the tradition of those first humans who discovered something revolutionary. Biological survival wasn't enough. It was necessary to live stories to be truly human. The next time you find yourself completely absorbed in a story, whether it's an epic movie, an engaging book, a fascinating podcast, or even a meme that makes you laugh until you cry, remember, you're not just passively entertaining yourself or wasting time. You are consciously participating in our species' oldest and most fundamentally human ritual, connecting to an unbroken cultural lineage of storytellers and listeners that spans hundreds of thousands of years across countless generations. The fire continues to burn. It has only changed fuel. The stories continue to be told. They have only changed medium. And somewhere deep in our cultural and neurological DNA, we are still those curious and hopeful faces illuminated by the flames, united by shared vulnerability, eagerly waiting to discover what happens next in the great collective narrative of the human experience. If this journey through the evolutionary beginnings of human entertainment has sparked your ancestral curiosity and made you recognize familiar patterns in your own modern behavior, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. After all, we are all direct descendants of those first storytellers, and their stories, transmitted across millennia of oral and now digital tradition, deserve to be heard, shared, and continued. The circle around the fire may have expanded to global and digital dimensions, But the essence remains unchanged. We are the species that tells stories to itself, and that is exactly what makes us fundamentally human.